In the summer of 1982, nearly 4 years before Chernobyl shocked the world and exposed the catastrophic failures of the Soviet nuclear program, another disaster unfolded deep within the Ukrainian USSR. One that the Soviet government successfully buried, erased from public knowledge, concealed even from many of its own officials, and denied so thoroughly that for decades historians weren't even sure whether it truly happened at all. Yet it did, and those who lived through it remember it as the night the South Ukrainian nuclear power plant nearly became the first Chernobyl, a meltdown that began with a rumble barely noticed by the workers on duty and escalated rapidly into a radiological nightmare that the USSR fought to silence rather than solve. The South Ukrainian NPP, located near the city of Yuzhno-Ukrainsk in the Mykolaiv region, was one of the Soviet Union's younger reactor complexes, built using the same RBMK and VVER reactor designs that Soviet engineers insisted were safe, modern, and superior to Western systems, claims that would prove tragically false. In 1982, Unit 1 had only recently entered full operation, and the plant's leadership was under immense pressure from Moscow to prove it could meet energy quotas during a period when the Soviet grid was increasingly unstable. The USSR desperately needed electricity, and nuclear power was the regime's proudest technological symbol, a triumph it used to compete with the West and claim superiority in scientific progress. This political pressure created a culture of silence and obedience inside the plant, where engineers knew that reporting defects, slowing production, or shutting down reactors would be viewed as sabotage or incompetence. On a humid night in June 1982, that dangerous culture collided with physics. It began subtly. In the control room, operators noticed a small but persistent fluctuation in coolant circulation within the primary loop of Unit 1. This wasn't unusual. Soviet equipment routinely malfunctioned, but the amplitude of the pressure spikes grew larger over several hours, and the alarms triggering on the board became difficult to ignore. Normally, protocol demanded an immediate reactor scram, a shutdown procedure requiring authorization from the plant shift chief. But that night, the shift chief hesitated. Moscow had recently reprimanded several energy directors across Ukraine for failing to meet production targets, and rumors circulated that shutting down a unit, even temporarily, could lead to dismissal, reassignment to a lower status plant, or even investigation by party committees. So instead of shutting down the reactor, the shift chief ordered the team to stabilize manually, a phrase workers hated because it meant improvisation, tweaking coolant flow, adjusting pump speeds, ignoring minor warning indicators in hopes that the system would self-correct without reducing power. But the system wasn't correcting. The coolant pump driving the primary loop began to vibrate violently, creating an audible hum that workers on the turbine floor heard echoing through the pipes. Minutes later, a loud clang reverberated through the plant as one of the pump's mounting brackets snapped. That failure caused a sudden drop in coolant flow, and reactor temperature began to rise. The control room is filled with alarm tones. Operators, now terrified, demanded permission to scram the reactor. Again, the shift chief hesitated. Soviet nuclear doctrine emphasized the belief that the reactor must obey the operator, leading many plant leaders to overestimate their ability to manage escalating failures. By the time authorization was granted, it was nearly too late. When workers slammed the scram button, the control rods, graphite-tipped rods identical to those that would later doom Chernobyl, began descending into the core. But in reactors of this design, the first seconds of rod insertion increase reactivity because of the graphite tips, and combined with the overheated state of the core, The insertion triggered a massive steam spike. The floor trembled. Steam pressure shot through the primary loop at levels far beyond safe limits. Several pipes bulged. One ruptured. Highly radioactive coolant sprayed into a maintenance corridor, drenching equipment and contaminating everything in its path. A worker named Vitaly, performing checks nearby, was hit by radioactive steam and collapsed instantly. His colleagues, terrified and untrained for real-world disaster, dragged him out only after hesitating for precious seconds, seconds that would later prove fatal for him. Inside the control room, operators watched gauges spin into ranges they had never seen in training simulations. The reactor was not yet in full meltdown, but partial core exposure was occurring. As water escaped through ruptured pipes, fuel assemblies began to overheat. Zirconium cladding weakened and split. Radioactive gases began to escape into the coolant system. Pressure built. Alarm lights lit the entire panel. The operators realized they had lost control. Meanwhile, outside the plant, no one was aware of the catastrophe unfolding. The city of Yuzhno-Ukrainsk, the new Soviet atom grad, built to house nuclear workers, slept under the warm summer air. Families were preparing for morning shifts, children asleep in high-rise apartments, farmers waking early to tend fields. No warnings were issued, no sirens sounded. The Soviet Union did not permit public evacuation unless a disaster was undeniable and uncontainable, and at that moment the regime's priority was secrecy, not safety. Back inside the plant, emergency teams attempted to flood the core with additional coolant. But with pipes ruptured and pressure uneven, the water failed to circulate properly. Instead, it filled the lower chamber beneath the core, while the upper sections remained dangerously exposed. A partial meltdown was now underway, and the next minutes would determine whether the reactor vessel held or whether a full-scale explosion, one capable of ripping open the building and poisoning half of southern Ukraine, would occur. At 3:17 a.m., a second rupture occurred. This time, a steam valve burst in a sealed maintenance room, blasting a crew of 3 engineers attempting to stabilize the pressure system. 2 died almost instantly of thermal burns. The third staggered out screaming for help, skin peeling from his arms, a sight surviving workers later recalled with horror. His badge dosimeter pegged out at the maximum reading. It had absorbed a lifetime radiation dose in seconds. But even then, no outside authorities were called. The plant managers followed the Soviet doctrine of internal liquidation, ordering workers to contain the problem themselves. They sealed off sections of the plant, shutting reinforced doors intended only for wartime use. Radiation levels inside several corridors rose to levels comparable to those inside Chernobyl's most radioactive rooms. Workers rotated every few minutes, each receiving doses far beyond safe limits. Many would die years later from cancers the state refused to acknowledge. By dawn, the reactor temperature began to stabilize. Not because the situation was safe, but because molten fuel fragments had slumped into a lower section of the core, where makeshift flooding had partially submerged them. This prevented full meltdown, but produced massive quantities of radioactive xenon, iodine, and cesium, which seeped through microfractures in the system. Some of that radiation escaped through ventilation shafts. Villagers downwind later reported metallic taste in their mouths, nausea, vomiting, and dead livestock, symptoms identical to those observed near Chernobyl in 1986. The Soviet government dismissed all complaints. The party issued an order. No written reports regarding this incident shall be created outside authorized channels. All medical staff were instructed to diagnose radiation poisoning as thermal trauma or chemical exposure. Workers who had witnessed the events were ordered to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of prosecution for revealing state secrets. Even plant personnel from other shifts were told that a minor equipment failure had occurred. The KGB arrived by evening, confiscating logs, interviewing shift chiefs, rewriting incident reports to downplay the scale of the disaster, and forbidding staff to speak even among themselves. Families of the dead were told their relatives had died in industrial accidents, and funerals were handled quietly. But among nuclear workers across the USSR, rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that South Ukraine had already suffered a meltdown before Chernobyl. Others claimed the reactor had nearly exploded. None knew the full truth because the regime had buried it deeper than the molten fuel itself. Western intelligence picked up hints too. CIA radiation monitors in DC. Turkey detected an unusual spike in airborne isotopes in early July 1982. Analysts suspected a Soviet nuclear accident, but without satellite imagery of an explosion, they could not confirm anything, and the Reagan administration chose not to escalate tensions over an unverified event. Thus, the world moved on, and the Soviet Union preserved one of its darkest nuclear secrets, until after its collapse, when the truth slowly began to surface through interviews, leaked documents, and testimonies of surviving workers who could finally speak without fear. But in 1982, the meltdown at South Ukraine was only beginning to reshape the region in ways the USSR worked desperately to conceal. By the time the sun rose over the Mykolaiv region on June 6, 1982, the South Ukrainian nuclear power plant was a sealed fortress of silence, its entrances guarded by local militia and plainclothes KGB operatives who had arrived before dawn, their unmarked vehicles parked in the staff lot like predators waiting for their prey to panic. The men inside the plant, those who had survived the night, were exhausted, trembling, and coated in invisible contamination they had no way to measure because their dosimeters had either maxed out hours earlier or been confiscated for recalibration, the euphemism the KGB used when collecting evidence they intended to alter or destroy. The control room still smelled of burnt wiring, scorched metal, and the faint chemical tang of ionized air. The floor was smeared with coolant residue and footprints left by workers running between panels during the worst of the crisis. Every monitor flickered with unstable readings. The reactor was no longer melting down, but it was nowhere near safe. Emergency cooling water continued to pour into the core chamber, hissing as it contacted superheated metal. Engineers monitoring the thermal profile noted that several fuel channels had collapsed entirely, meaning portions of the fuel assemblies were now a melted mass at the bottom of the pressure vessel, an unmistakable sign of partial meltdown. Yet officially, nothing catastrophic had happened. Localized overheating was the phrase dictated from Moscow. The real danger now was not only the damaged reactor, but the chain of decisions required to keep the meltdown from becoming public knowledge. At 9:12 a.m., a convoy of high-ranking officials from the Ministry of Energy, the State Committee for Atomic Supervision, and the KGB Directorate for Special Zone Security arrived at the plant. Their goal was not rescue, not investigation, not truth. They were there to restore control over the narrative. The man placed in charge of the cover-up was Colonel Viktor Gusev, a stern-faced officer whose specialty it was containment of sensitive industrial events. His first order was chilling in its simplicity. All documentation is classified. All personnel are to be interviewed. No one leaves without authorization. Workers who had witnessed the pump rupture, the steam explosion, or the manual flooding efforts were escorted individually to a conference room where interrogators demanded written accounts that matched the official technical explanation. Any reference to a meltdown, radiation exposure, control rod malfunction, ruptured coolant pipes, or casualties was erased. Operators who insisted on accuracy were threatened with dismissal, prosecution under Article 190, spreading falsehoods damaging to the Soviet state, or reassignment to remote Siberian facilities. One technician who repeatedly insisted that molten fuel had breached its cladding was escorted out of the plant and never returned. Rumors spread that he had been detained for anti-Soviet agitation. While the interrogations proceeded, a separate team of emergency engineers, hastily flown in from Moscow and Leningrad, began assessing the reactor damage. They were veterans of earlier Soviet nuclear incidents: Obninsk 1969, Leningrad 1975, Beloyarsk 1977. Accidents the public never learned about, but which had revealed fundamental weaknesses in Soviet reactor designs. They quickly realized the South Ukrainian Unit 1 incident was among the worst they had seen. Gamma radiation levels inside several sealed corridors reached levels capable of killing a person within minutes. The melted fuel mass at the bottom of the core had produced a cocktail of radioactive gases that continued to leak into the containment structures. The pressure vessel itself had survived, a miracle according to one engineer, but its internal geometry was permanently warped. Repairing it would be almost impossible. Yet scrapping the reactor meant admitting the scale of the accident, which the USSR refused to do. As the engineers examined the core, the political crisis grew. The meltdown had caused a plume of radioactive gases to drift northward during the early hours of the morning. In several villages, residents reported nausea, headaches, rashes, and sudden death among livestock. Local doctors, not aware of the nuclear incident, diagnosed patients with food poisoning or heat exhaustion. Veterinarians were told not to file reports. The KGB established exclusion zones disguised as military training areas to prevent civilians from approaching contaminated fields. Trucks loaded with topsoil were quietly brought in to cover several irradiated patches of farmland. But the contamination could not be completely hidden. In Yuzhno-Ukrainsk, some residents noticed soldiers washing the exterior of the plant with fire hoses, a standard decontamination procedure. Others saw men wearing rubber suits unloading crates from the back of a military transport truck. At a local bus stop, a rumor circulated that a chemical spill had occurred. Another rumor, started by a frightened worker's wife, whispered the truth. The reactor broke. That whisper reached the ears of city administrators, who immediately contacted party headquarters for guidance. The response was swift. There is to be no discussion of the power station. Any inquiries are to be redirected to the Regional Communication Department. Prevent the spread of harmful rumors. Teachers were instructed to discourage students from asking about unusual activity around the plant. Factory directors were told to assure their workers that the temporary reduction in electrical output was routine maintenance. Local newspapers printed bland articles celebrating agricultural progress, a new kindergarten opening, and the success of Soviet athletes, nothing hinting at the worst nuclear accident in Ukrainian history prior to Chernobyl. Meanwhile, inside the plant, tragedy continued. Several workers exposed to the initial steam rupture were transported to a restricted medical wing, staffed by military doctors trained in radiation illness. These men suffered from acute radiation syndrome, vomiting, seizures, blistered skin, dropping blood counts, rapid hair loss. Their families were not allowed to visit. When one wife demanded to see her husband, she was told he had been transferred to a hospital in Odessa. In reality, he lay dying in a quarantined basement, wrapped in sheets already stained with blood from radiation-induced hemorrhaging. Only after his death did the state contact her, informing her that he had succumbed to heart failure due to workplace strain, and that his body had been cremated for sanitary reasons. She was not permitted to see the ashes. Such lies were standard procedure. The Soviet nuclear program operated under the doctrine of maximum secrecy, minimum responsibility, a philosophy that valued the state's image over human life. Every accident was classified. Every failure was buried. Every fatality was rewritten. And now, the entire machinery of that system was being used to erase South Ukraine's near meltdown. By the third day after the accident, the situation inside the plant stabilized enough for external cooling systems to take over. But stabilizing the reactor did nothing to lessen the political danger. Moscow feared that Western intelligence might detect the event. American U-2 flights monitored atmospheric radiation across Eastern Europe. Any spike in isotopes could suggest a nuclear accident, or worse, a weapons test. To preempt suspicion, the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a vague report attributing minor radiological fluctuations detected in the Black Sea region to a meteorological anomaly. Internally, however, panic spread through the highest levels of the Soviet government. The South Ukraine incident had exposed deep structural flaws in the reactor design, flaws that also existed at dozens of other plants across the USSR. Yet admitting the shortcomings meant halting construction at a time when the Soviet economy desperately needed energy output from its reactors. The Politburo chose the same path it always chose: denial, concealment, and continued operation. Engineers who attempted to push for reforms or shutdowns were dismissed as alarmists. Some were reassigned to remote research labs. Others left the nuclear program entirely. A handful, fearing another disaster, began secretly documenting the reactor's weaknesses, compiling reports that would later prove invaluable during the post-Soviet investigations of the 1990s. But in 1982, these men were branded as troublemakers. One senior engineer confided to a colleague, "We did not fix the problem. We only hid it. And what is hidden today will explode tomorrow." His prediction would come true at Chernobyl. Back at South Ukraine, repairs began. Specialized welding teams were brought in to patch ruptured pipes. The reactor vessel was reinforced with external bracing to compensate for its internal distortion. Makeshift filters were installed on ventilation shafts to reduce radioactive discharge. Every measure was temporary. Every fix was cosmetic. The plant would never be truly safe again, but shutting it down was forbidden. By the end of the first week, the KGB believed the crisis was contained. No foreign governments had issued inquiries. No media leaks had occurred. No workers had dared to defy the secrecy orders. For a moment, it appeared that the meltdown would indeed vanish into the void of classified history. But outside the plant, fear lingered. Children in nearby villages developed unusual rashes. Farmers reported stillborn calves. Several fishermen noticed dead fish floating in the southern Bug River. A strange silence fell over the region, not imposed by the KGB, but generated naturally by communities who sensed that something toxic had seeped into their land, their air, their bodies. Mothers kept their children indoors. Some villagers fled to relatives in Odessa or Kiev. Others stayed but refused to drink local water. The truth, though absent from newspapers, revealed itself in symptoms. Radiation does not obey politics. It leaves a trail that even a government as powerful as the Soviet Union cannot fully erase. And yet Moscow believed it had succeeded. 6 months later, in early 1983, the South Ukrainian reactor was quietly returned to service. The incident was classified at the highest level. The official record stated that a minor equipment malfunction had occurred, resulting in brief overheating, but no serious consequences. The world remained unaware. Even many senior Soviet officials had no idea how close Ukraine had come to becoming an uninhabitable wasteland 4 years before Chernobyl. Only decades later, when the USSR collapsed and archives opened, would investigators uncover fragments of the truth. Fragments pointing to a disaster so severe it could have changed the entire course of the Cold War if the reactor had exploded. But in 1982, as the South Ukrainian plant resumed operations, the men who had witnessed the near meltdown lived with a different knowledge, a secret that gnawed at them every time they stepped into the control room, a silent dread that whispered, "It will happen again." And they were right. As autumn approached in 1982, the South Ukrainian nuclear power plant existed in a state that could only be described as suspended catastrophe. A facility that had survived a meltdown but was still operating as though nothing had occurred. Its internal wounds plastered over with political directives rather than engineering solutions. Its traumatized workers bound by secrecy oaths that carried heavier penalties than the radiation that had burned their skin. The KGB's suppression apparatus remained in place long after the immediate crisis ended. Every worker entering the plant passed through reinforced checkpoints, staffed by stern-faced officers who watched for any sign of dissent or loose talk. Conversations on buses, in cafeterias, even in family apartments were monitored by informants. Internal mail was screened. Typewriters were cataloged and inspected. This paranoid environment, while oppressive, was also revealing. The more effort the state invested in the cover-up, the clearer it became that the meltdown had not been an isolated mechanical failure, but a symptom of systemic rot infecting the entire Soviet nuclear program. Rot born from rushing reactors into operation to meet energy quotas. Rot born from political leaders who demanded output over safety. Rot born from a culture where engineers feared the party more than the reactor core itself. And yet the danger did not end with silenced workers. Deep within the core, molten fragments of fuel remained fused to the bottom of the pressure vessel, forming what Soviet scientists grimly referred to as the elephant's foot, a term later popularized at Chernobyl, but originating quietly at South Ukraine. This mass was not as large or as radioactive as the one produced during Chernobyl's 1986 explosion, but it was still a lethal configuration. Attempts to estimate its composition were hindered by damaged instrumentation. The plant's directors ordered diagnostic scans, but the neutron detectors produced confusing readings, at times spiking unexpectedly as if small reactivity pockets were forming within the melted fuel. Several physicists warned that such pockets could lead to mini-criticalities, brief flashes of uncontrolled fission capable of releasing bursts of radiation. One such warning came from a respected nuclear physicist named Dr. Oleg Malenkov, who traveled from Moscow to assess the core. In his report, he wrote plainly that continued operation of Unit 1 poses significant risk of recriticality events. But when this statement reached the Ministry of Energy, it was crossed out and replaced with, "The reactor is stable under controlled conditions," Malenkov protested. He was summoned to a consultation meeting, after which he never again worked in Soviet civilian nuclear energy. He was reassigned to an obscure military research depot in Novosibirsk. His colleagues understood this for what it was, exile for telling the truth. Meanwhile, across the region, strange illnesses continued appearing. In the small town of Konstantinovka, a cluster of young children developed unexplained thyroid swellings. Several factory workers in Yuzhno-Ukrainsk reported tingling neuropathy in their extremities. Local clinicians recognized radiation-linked symptoms, but were discouraged from making such diagnoses. Health ministry officials instructed doctors to classify the conditions as seasonal viral complications. One particularly defiant doctor attempted to file a report about abnormal white blood cell patterns among plant workers. Within days, he was removed from his post for failure to meet professional standards. Yet no degree of censorship could stop the physical consequences. Radiation had seeped into groundwater near the plant. Carried by underground flows the Soviets had failed to map. It accumulated in low-lying marshes where livestock grazed. Farmers noticed that some cows refused to drink from certain ponds, as if instinct sensed what human authorities denied. Grass growing near irrigation canals exhibited subtle discoloration. In village orchards, a few fruit trees bore mutated growth patterns, twisted limbs, smaller leaves, oddly shaped fruit. Only decades later, independent biologists studying preserved samples would confirm elevated cesium and strontium isotopes in the region dating back to the summer of 1982. Inside the plant, workers lived with perpetual dread. Every shift began with nervous glances at reactor gauges, even though many gauges were still malfunctioning from radiation damage sustained during the meltdown. Every rumble from the cooling system made technicians flinch. Every alarm, no matter how routine, sent jolts of adrenaline through the control room. Many workers smoked heavily to calm their nerves. Others drank quietly in stairwells before beginning their shifts. One operator later confessed in a declassified interview from the 1990s. "We were walking beside death. We did not control the reactor. We controlled our fear." What made the situation even worse was the growing pressure from Moscow to restore the plant's energy output to full capacity. The Soviet Union in the early 1980s was experiencing critical energy shortages. Natural gas infrastructure was strained, coal plants were aging, and hydroelectric output fluctuated with seasonal droughts. Nuclear energy had been touted as the USSR's triumph, a promise of abundant, modern, socialist-engineered power that would outshine the West. Therefore, admitting that one of their newest reactors had nearly destroyed itself was politically impossible. Instead, the central government demanded the plant meet its original performance quotas. This meant increasing output incrementally each month, even as engineers privately insisted the reactor vessel was too compromised to handle full power. Under this relentless pressure, maintenance schedules were shortened, inspections rushed, and questionable equipment approved for use. Several safety specialists resigned rather than participate in what they considered suicidal decisions. Their resignations were quietly accepted, but their replacements were chosen for loyalty, not competence. And thus, the most dangerous phase of the cover-up began. The forced normalization of a reactor that should have been permanently shut down. At the same time, the geopolitical landscape shaped how thoroughly the Soviets buried the truth. In 1982, the Cold War was entering a sharpened phase. Relations with the United States were icy following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. NATO had approved the deployment of Pershing II missiles in Europe, which the USSR viewed as an existential threat. Soviet leadership feared that any sign of weakness, especially nuclear technological weakness, would embolden the West. Therefore, the South Ukrainian meltdown was treated as a national security threat on par with espionage. Even within the When Western intelligence analysts noticed minor radiation anomalies near the Black Sea, they speculated about submarine reactor leakage, not a nuclear power plant emergency. The Soviets, relieved by the misinterpretation, doubled down on secrecy. In Kiev, regional party officials held private meetings instructing local leaders never to acknowledge the crisis. Not now, not ever. The Ukrainian USSR, after all, already hosted several major industrial complexes that were vital to the Soviet economy. The stability of the region could not be jeopardized by unnecessary panic, but no amount of political pressure could erase what the workers themselves had lived through. Many fell ill within months, suffering from chronic fatigue, skin lesions, immune dysfunction, and mysterious organ failures. Some died quietly, their death certificates listing vague causes such as cardiac insufficiency or circulatory collapse. Their families received modest state compensation and stern warnings to avoid discussing their loved ones' involvement with the plant. Those who remained on staff formed a silent brotherhood forged in trauma. They avoided speaking openly, but in glances, in half-finished sentences, in shared cigarettes outside the turbine hall, they communicated the truth. The reactor was wounded, and they were prisoners trapped with it. Despite everything, they still worked. The Soviet system trapped them economically and ideologically. Many believed that resigning would lead to blacklisting. Others feared KGB retaliation. A few clung to the hope that the reactor could be stabilized through unofficial improvements. These informal fixes, welds done at night, pipes reinforced without authorization, homemade shielding plates installed by desperate technicians, reflected both the ingenuity and the desperation of men abandoned by their own government. Meanwhile, the psychological toll deepened. One operator later recalled how he dreamt of the control room collapsing into molten light. Another admitted he could not stand the sound of hissing steam in everyday life without breaking into a sweat. Some developed alcoholism. Others isolated themselves from family, unable to talk about what haunted them. A few committed suicide. Their deaths were never connected publicly to the accident. Outside the plant, the consequences spread. Beekeepers noticed declining honey production. Fishermen found abnormalities in river fish. Several pregnant women in the area miscarried, though no official pattern was ever acknowledged. Environmental monitoring stations, those not falsified, recorded elevated isotopes after rainfall. When a mid-level meteorologist attempted to report the anomaly, his superiors instructed him to destroy the logbook. Even the land began to bear scars. In certain fields, crops grew unevenly. Soil samples taken secretly by university researchers contained radioactive isotopes inconsistent with natural background levels. These findings were quietly handed to a sympathetic professor who locked them in a desk drawer with the intention of publishing them someday, after the collapse of the USSR. And still, the truth remained buried beneath layers of lies. The reactor kept operating. The workers kept suffering. The contamination kept spreading. And the Soviet government kept believing it had successfully erased one of the gravest nuclear near disasters in its history. But the truth has weight. It does not vanish. It sinks into the ground, into the bones of workers, into sealed archives, into whispers that survive even the KGB. And in the shadows of 1982, a new and more horrifying question began forming among the engineers who understood the reactor's condition better than anyone else. If something this severe could be hidden, what else in the Soviet nuclear program was rotting behind closed doors? The answer, they would find 4 years later at Chernobyl, was everything. Through the winter of 1982 and into early 1983, the South Ukrainian nuclear power plant existed like a wounded animal forced to continue running, despite shattered bones and internal bleeding. Its operations maintained not by confidence, but by coercion, denial, and the crushing weight of Soviet political expectations. And as temperatures dropped across the Mykolaiv region, the frozen landscape seemed to echo the atmosphere of suffocation within the plant, cold, brittle, and ready to fracture under the slightest pressure. The reactor, though stabilizing superficially after emergency interventions, remained a barely contained hazard. Instrumentation failures persisted, with temperature sensors drifting unpredictably, neutron detectors producing inconsistent readings, and coolant flow meters freezing at high values even when engineers could hear the pumps straining to maintain circulation. Workers quickly learned that many of the numbers displayed on control boards no longer reflected reality. Instead, they relied on intuition, on the memory of what normal operations should sound like, on the vibration of pipes, on the smell of overheated metal. Primitive senses replacing the failed technology meant to protect them. This unspoken shift from science to survival was one of the clearest indicators of how deeply the accident had undermined the plant's integrity. Yet the Soviet government insisted that Unit 1 resume full operation, driven by energy shortfalls across the Ukrainian USSR, and the ideological demand that Soviet nuclear technology remain untarnished in the official narrative. The Ministry of Energy sent directives outlining production quotas that were not simply unrealistic, they were dangerous. Several senior engineers drafted a private memorandum warning that increasing the reactor's output could destabilize the melted fuel conglomerate at the bottom of the pressure vessel, potentially causing uneven neutron flux and localized recriticality events. The memo circulated briefly among technical specialists before being confiscated by KGB officers. The authors were interrogated and accused of pessimistic distortion of Soviet technological achievements, a charge equivalent to professional suicide. The memo vanished into a classified archive. The demands continued. Meanwhile, the physical consequences of the meltdown manifested in increasingly disturbing ways. One afternoon in February 1983, a radiation monitoring technician named Yuri noticed an unusual reading on his portable dosimeter while inspecting ventilation shafts. The reading was too high to be a malfunction, but too localized to be a major leak. Tracing the source, he discovered a cluster of dust accumulation, tiny, glitter-like particles that shimmered in the light. This dust, later quietly sampled, was found to contain radioactive isotopes consistent with fuel fragmentation. In other words, microscopic pieces of the reactor core were circulating through the plant's ventilation system. Yuri reported his findings to his supervisor, who warned him never to mention it again. 3 weeks later, Yuri collapsed at home with severe internal bleeding. Doctors diagnosed him with acute bone marrow suppression. He died before spring. His death certificate cited complications from chronic illness. His wife received no explanation. Such tragedies multiplied. At least 8 workers from the original emergency response team died within 18 months, some from leukemia, others from organ failure, all under vague diagnostic labels that concealed the truth. The KGB maintained a file titled Special Illness Cases, 1982-1984, tracking these deaths in cold clinical language. Instead of acknowledging radiation exposure, the file categorized each fatality as statistically insignificant. The workers' families, bound by silence, mourned privately. Those who continued, working at the plant, carried their grief like a second radiation burden, invisible but lethal over time. Beyond human suffering, the environment bore ongoing damage. snowmelt in early spring, carried contaminants into tributaries of the Southern Bug River. Farmers downstream reported unusually high animal mortality, sheep born with deformities, chickens dying suddenly, pigs refusing to eat. When veterinarians attempted to test water samples, officials seized the results. The livestock deaths were written off as harsh winter effects. Several wells in nearby villages were quietly closed, their closures attributed to maintenance. Residents were advised to boil water, though without explanation. A tacit understanding formed. Something was wrong, and the government would never tell them what. Amid this atmosphere of distrust, several plant workers began keeping secret diaries, risky acts punishable by imprisonment if discovered. These diaries captured the psychological disintegration of the workforce, confessions of nightmares in which the reactor exploded, descriptions of anxiety attacks triggered by the hum of machinery, reflections on guilt, fear, and helplessness. One operator wrote, "Every day I walk into this place, I feel like I'm entering a grave that hasn't been filled yet." Another wrote, "I do not fear death. I fear that the state will pretend I never existed." Such writings would not surface until after the fall of the USSR, but their existence revealed how deeply the accident had scarred the men trapped inside its secrecy. The plant's managers, under constant scrutiny from the KGB, attempted to maintain morale by emphasizing socialist duty. They held mandatory meetings extolling Soviet nuclear progress, praising workers as heroes of industrial development, and promising that the plant would soon become a model of Soviet technological excellence. But these speeches rang hollow. Workers knew that the managers' optimism was manufactured. They had seen the collapsed fuel channels, the warped metal, the contaminated tunnels. They had watched colleagues die. They had felt the lies pressed upon them like a weight on their lungs. Underneath the facade of ideological triumph, fear hardened into bitterness. The bitterness deepened further in mid-1983, when the Soviet Union announced plans to expand nuclear capacity across the republics. More plants, more reactors, more danger. Those who understood nuclear physics recognized these expansions as a gamble. The USSR was building more of the very technology it had proven incapable of maintaining safely. Yet no one with authority seemed willing to confront this reality. Within the Kremlin, reports on the South Ukrainian meltdown circulated only among a handful of officials. Most were eager to minimize discussion. Some feared political consequences. Others genuinely believed the accident was resolved. But a few, particularly military analysts, worried that the growing pattern of Soviet nuclear incidents could create catastrophic vulnerabilities, weaknesses that NATO intelligence might eventually exploit. Ironically, the same secrecy meant to protect Soviet power was slowly eroding it from within. While political leaders debated risk, the scientific community faced a different crisis. A small group of high-level nuclear physicists remained aware of the meltdown and attempted to calculate long-term structural damage. Their analysis was grim. The pressure vessel's metallurgical integrity had been permanently compromised by the extreme heat load during the meltdown. The concrete biological shield surrounding the vessel had absorbed significant radiation, weakening its internal structure. Continued thermal cycling from ongoing reactor operation could cause microfractures, eventually leading to large-scale structural failure. Additionally, the melted fuel mass remained an unpredictable variable. Its geometry was irregular, its neutron moderation uneven, and its cooling inconsistent. In certain thermal states, it could produce neutron spikes capable of destabilizing the reactor. Despite these warnings, recommendations to decommission the unit were rejected. To shut it down would require admitting the truth, not just about the accident, but about Soviet nuclear incompetence. Instead, the plant received superficial upgrades: new paint on walls, replaced control panels, improved signage, patched leaks, and publicly staged maintenance sessions designed to impress visiting party officials. It was a facade, and everyone working there knew it. Yet beneath the fear and secrecy, another force brewed: resentment. As word of workers' illnesses leaked quietly through the region, local trust in the government deteriorated. The people could not protest openly. The KGB monitored dissent ruthlessly, but distrust manifested in subtle acts: refusing to attend state celebrations, ignoring official pamphlets, whispering private warnings to neighbors. The government sensed this shift and responded with propaganda campaigns praising Soviet nuclear achievements and condemning foreign disinformation. Posters appeared declaring, "The atom serves peace." Yet these slogans hung ironically in villages where livestock were dying mysteriously, and children developed unexplained health conditions. Even as the Soviet Union tried to bury the truth, reality seeped through the cracks like radiation through broken shielding. Meanwhile, in Western intelligence circles, subtle clues began arousing suspicion. Analysts observed fluctuations in regional electricity output. Satellite images detected unusual construction around the plant: new buildings, heavy machinery, and restricted zones. Atmospheric sensors recorded minor isotopic traces drifting over the Black Sea. While none of this definitively proved a meltdown, it suggested an event of significance. In Washington and London, analysts debated whether the USSR had experienced another nuclear submarine incident or a civilian reactor failure. Some intelligence reports noted similarities to the pattern of secrecy surrounding the 1975 Leningrad meltdown. But without concrete evidence, these suspicions faded into the background noise of Cold War uncertainty. Back in Ukraine, the plant entered its most dangerous phase: the era of normalized dysfunction. The meltdown had never ended. It had simply been incorporated into daily operation. Workers treated radiation hotspots as unavoidable nuisances. Engineers designed workarounds for damaged systems rather than repairing them properly. Managers emphasized output over safety, and all the while, the reactor loomed like a volcano, plugged with concrete and lies. Many inside the plant sensed that the disaster was not truly behind them, that the meltdown had created a fault line within the reactor, within the plant, within the Soviet nuclear system itself, a fault line that would eventually rupture again somewhere, somehow. As 1984 approached, the South Ukrainian incident remained buried in classified archives, but its legacy had already begun reshaping the fate of Soviet nuclear power. Engineers who left the industry carried their warnings into academic discussions. Scientists quietly shared concerns with foreign colleagues during international conferences, speaking carefully to avoid revealing classified details. A handful of whistleblowers attempted to alert Western journalists, but were intercepted. The truth struggled to escape, but cracks in the wall of secrecy were beginning to form. Those cracks would widen with each passing year, and when the world finally witnessed the inferno at Chernobyl in April 1986, the South Ukrainian meltdown would resurface, not as a surprise, but as a prophecy fulfilled. By 1985, the South Ukrainian nuclear power plant had become a monument to the Soviet Union's talent for forcing danger into silence, a reactor that had melted down enough to poison land, kill workers, and nearly rupture the pressure vessel, yet was still operating under the pretense of normalcy, its dark secret known only to a shrinking circle of engineers, bureaucrats, and KGB officers who believed some reluctantly, others fanatically, that concealing the truth protected the state more than preserving life. The plant looked outwardly functional, with new concrete poured around the turbine hall, renovated administrative buildings, and propaganda banners praising Soviet engineering brilliance. But beneath this surface lay the same crippled core that had nearly ignited a regional catastrophe 3 years earlier, a core whose integrity continued to degrade with each heating and cooling cycle. Even minor operational anomalies, steam surges, pressure fluctuations, coolant pump oscillations, were interpreted by workers not as routine behavior, but as possible preludes to disaster, triggering adrenaline spikes and frantic cross-checking of gauges they no longer trusted. Psychologically, they were trapped inside the memory of 1982, unable to escape the trauma even as the state demanded they behave as though nothing had happened. This culture of whispered terror permeated every level of the plant. New workers brought in after 1983 received sanitized training manuals that omitted any reference to the meltdown. They were told that certain areas were restricted for renovation, that certain meters were being recalibrated, and that older staff were overly cautious due to stressful work environments. Younger technicians noticed the haunted expressions of veterans, but lacked the context to understand them. Meanwhile, the veterans watched the newcomers with a mixture of pity and resentment. Pity because these young men had no idea the danger they were stepping into. Resentment because management expected them to maintain a lie that endangered the next generation as surely as it had destroyed the last. One young operator, years later, recalled how an older colleague once grabbed him by the arm after he casually leaned against a turbine housing, whispering harshly, "Do not trust what this place tells you. Trust only what you feel. The instruments lie." He never understood that warning until the Soviet Union collapsed and the truth finally surfaced. But before that collapse, before Glasnost, before Chernobyl, before archives began to crack open, the truth lived only in hidden conversations. And those conversations grew more urgent as new structural symptoms began to emerge inside the plant around late 1985. Engineers performing routine inspections, those few inspections that weren't falsified, noticed microfractures spreading through the containment walls, fractures caused by years of sustained neutron bombardment from the melted fuel mass. These fractures were hairline thin, but expanding gradually, and any one of them could widen into a breach if exposed to sudden thermal shock. The cooling system, still weakened since the accident, struggled during seasonal temperature changes, especially in winter, when external water sources dropped several degrees. The risk of freezing in auxiliary pipes forced workers to perform frequent manual flushes in sub-zero weather, often at night, carrying portable heaters and steel tools that rattled in the wind. More than once, men slipped on icy surfaces and injured themselves, but such incidents were rarely reported officially. Even safety logs had become political instruments, recording only what superiors wanted to see. By early 1986, the South Ukrainian plant stood as a precarious symbol of everything wrong with the Soviet nuclear program. Secrecy instead of transparency, speed instead of caution, ideology instead of science. And then, in April of that year, Chernobyl exploded. The shockwaves, political, scientific, moral, reverberated instantly through the USSR. In the days following the Chernobyl disaster, a quiet panic spread through the South Ukrainian workforce. Those who had lived through the 1982 meltdown recognized eerie parallels, the same design vulnerabilities, the same disregard for warnings, the same reckless confidence in flawed technology. For the first time, Some workers dared to speak guardedly about what had happened 4 years earlier. A few even contemplated anonymously informing authorities in Kyiv, but the KGB still monitored communications, and fear prevailed. Still, whispers increased, and the truth that had been buried so deeply began to tremble beneath the surface. Chernobyl's plume of radioactive fallout drifted across Europe, revealing the catastrophic potential of Soviet nuclear negligence to the entire world. International scrutiny intensified overnight. Western intelligence agencies expanded their monitoring of all Soviet nuclear plants, including satellite surveillance of South Ukraine. For the first time, foreign analysts noticed anomalies significant enough to raise suspicion. Inconsistent thermal signatures, abnormal steam venting, structural reinforcements inconsistent with documented maintenance, and fluctuating isotopic readings in nearby air samples. Meanwhile, inside the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced policies of glasnost and perestroika, pushing for transparency and economic reform. These policies created cracks, small at first, in the wall of secrecy that had shielded the South Ukrainian meltdown from exposure. Investigative journalists, emboldened by new freedoms, began looking into nuclear safety across the USSR. Several reporters attempted to interview plant workers. Most were too terrified to speak. A few offered vague comments hinting at past issues. One journalist, Valentina Petrenko, managed to obtain an anonymous letter describing a dangerous reactor event in the summer of 1982, but lacked details. She filed it away, planning to return after finishing her coverage of Chernobyl. Over time, as Chernobyl inquiries consumed public attention, the South Ukrainian meltdown once again slipped into obscurity, protected by the enormity of a disaster that dwarfed all others. But the truth didn't die, it slept. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the archives opened. Among the millions of documents released in the early 1990s, Western analysts discovered a classified dossier labeled simply Incident at South Ukrainian NPP, June 1982. It contained heavily redacted summaries of containment breaches, radiation exposure logs, KGB reports on worker interrogations, and technical analyses confirming meltdown conditions. Additional documents surfaced later, including medical records of irradiated workers and internal communications between the Ministry of Energy and regional party officials. For the first time, researchers pieced together the extent of the accident: a partial meltdown, coolant system failure, fuel channel collapse, radiation releases affecting dozens of villages, multiple worker fatalities, and widespread falsification of data. International nuclear experts who reviewed the recovered materials concluded that the 1982 meltdown was one of the worst nuclear accidents in history, worse than 3 Mile Island, comparable to the early stages of Chernobyl, and avoided a catastrophic explosion only through luck and desperate manual intervention. The revelation stunned scholars and policymakers. How could such a severe accident have been hidden for 9 years? How many other incidents remained hidden? And what did this say about the safety of Soviet-built reactors still operating across Eastern Europe? As the truth emerged publicly throughout the 1990s, survivors of the meltdown began sharing their stories. Some spoke hesitantly, still fearful after decades of conditioning. Others spoke with anger sharpened over time. They described the terror of the night of the meltdown, the lies forced upon them, the colleagues they watched die, the psychological scars they carried, and the betrayal they felt by a government that valued ideology over human life. One technician, interviewed in 1996, said through tears, "We saved the reactor, we saved the country, but the country didn't save us." Families of dead workers learned how their husbands and sons had really died. Villagers discovered why their livestock had miscarried, why their children had experienced health issues, why their wells had been quietly replaced. The truth was devastating, but it also provided closure. Modern investigators studying the South Ukrainian incident now view it as a critical precursor to Chernobyl, not because it caused the later disaster, but because it revealed systemic flaws the USSR chose to ignore. Those flaws were not technical alone. They were cultural, political, structural. They were the product of a system that preferred silence to accountability, that treated information as a weapon rather than a tool, that feared embarrassment more than catastrophe. Today, decades later, the legacy of the 1982 meltdown lives on. The reactor was eventually modernized after Ukraine gained independence, but the scars, both physical and historical, remain embedded in the land and in the memories of those who lived through it. Environmental studies still detect traces of contamination dating back to the 1980s. Aging workers still suffer from illnesses rooted in radiation exposure, and historians continue to uncover documents suggesting the true scale of the accident may have been even larger than currently understood. Yet, perhaps the most haunting truth is this: if not for the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world might never have learned anything about the meltdown at all. It would have remained a ghost, an unmarked chapter in the deadly story of Cold War nuclear secrecy. But the world did learn. And now, as nations continue to debate the role of nuclear power, the South Ukrainian meltdown stands as a stark reminder that technology without transparency, power without accountability, and secrecy without conscience can turn even the most promising reactor into a ticking time bomb hidden behind locked doors and propaganda banners. In the end, the 1982 disaster was not just a failure of engineering. It was a failure of a system built on fear, silence, and the belief that truth itself could be contained like radiation behind concrete walls. It could not, and it never will.